It's Monday, August 8th. Senate Democrats' economic spending bill clears the finish line. We start here.
And the bill, as amended, is passed.
After months of deadlock, Democrats celebrate a legislative win.
They say this is the single biggest investment the U.S. has ever made in fighting climate change.
What it could mean for your wallet. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict turns deadly in Gaza.
These militant groups are vying to be the group that represents the Palestinian people.
Why the latest flare-up is different this time around. And in Ukraine, Europe's biggest nuclear plant is under fire.
It was hit by shelling, reportedly causing one of the reactors to even shut down.
Russia and Ukraine point fingers as concerns mount over potential disaster. From ABC News, this is Start Here. I'm Michelle Franzen. Hi there, Brad's off today. I'll be taking you through the news this morning.
It's been a long, tough, and winding road. But at last, we have arrived.
In a rare weekend marathon session, Senate Democrats in lockstep harnessed the 50 votes needed to pass the Inflation Reduction Act.
The yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative, and the bill, as amended, is passed.
Republicans proposed dozens of amendments, but in the end, no GOP senators voted for the final bill. The series of spending packages pared down from the president's earlier $3.5 trillion domestic agenda still has a hefty tab of more than $700 billion. It includes cost-cutting health care measures, climate initiatives, and money left over to pay down the national debt. Democrats say all paid for by raising corporate taxes. White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks joins us. She's been tracking this whole event all weekend. Mary Alice, Democrats delivered a win not only for their own party, but also for President Biden. So what do Americans get out of it?
Yeah, first, this is historic, and Democrats have talked about it that way. They say that not only was it something that voters wanted, that they can point to and talk about with voters on the campaign trail, but that this bill represented key parts of President Biden's legislative agenda, a legislative agenda that, frankly, had been stalled for a long time.
Our bill reduces inflation, lowers costs, creates millions of manufacturing jobs, enhances our energy security.
They say this is the single biggest investment the U.S. has ever made in fighting climate change.
My North Star was always 40% reduction in the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere by 2030, and we've achieved that North Star.
You know, I think that the average consumer is going to look really closely at some of the Medicare provisions. This bill will allow Medicare to negotiate the price of some key prescription drugs. They say that that's going to be a big cost saver for seniors.
We capped the price of insulin for seniors on Medicare at $35 a month.
And it also sets a $2,000 annual cap on prescription drug costs for seniors. I think there's going to be a lot of Medicare recipients looking at those provisions and seeing some real impacts, some real sort of dollar signs and savings in their own lives.
Yeah, Mary Alice, you mentioned that this was stalled, but it was dead for a while, this package. Two holdout senators, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, on board with that spending package. So what changed to get both over the line to join fellow Democrats?
Yeah, there was a lot of time this last year when we thought this had completely fallen apart. We thought it was going nowhere. I mean, these were halting, faltering, start and stop negotiations off and on. I think we have to remember that this final deal is so much smaller than what President Biden and some in Democratic leadership first pitched.
We need the Senate to follow the House of Representatives' lead and pass my Build Back Better bill.
I mean, they wanted a huge bill that included funding for universal child care, minimum wage increases, paid maternity leave. They especially had to curtail what they wanted to do on climate and renewable energy.
Well, there is no Build Back Better, so let's start there, okay? What we should be looking at is what we can do and what we have done.
You know, one thing that was interesting to me listening to Senator Joe Manchin over the last few weeks, he seemed to really come around on this tax provision that helps Democrats pay for the bill. They locked in a corporate minimum tax rate of 15%. And Joe Manchin essentially said that he did come to realize that there were some corporations that were not paying anything in corporate taxes when all the dust settled. And he thought that it was right to set a minimum tax, a floor for big corporations.
This is not adding to inflation. This is going to help take us to a place of prosperity. I truly believe in my heart.
We know that Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema, like you said, also one of the very last holdouts. She also pushed back on some of the tax changes. But big picture, they were able to get there, and they did not have votes to spare, so they had to get everyone on board.
Yeah, and they weren't able to get one single Republican on board. So what were Republicans objecting to?
Largely those tax hikes. I mean, Republicans have argued that this is just not the time to put any new taxes in place.
But amazingly, Senate Democrats are misreading the American people's outrage as a mandate for yet another reckless taxing and spending spree.
They've said that any new spending from the government is dangerous. They don't like the changes to Medicare. They didn't want Democrats, to get a win here, and they fundamentally, blasted this bill from the very beginning.
I don't mind working with Democrats when it matters and it helps, but this to me is insane.
And I should say that it was interesting over the last few days with these marathon voting sessions that lasted through the night. We also heard grumblings from the far left.
A bill which has some good features, but also, in my view, has some very bad features.
Senator Bernie Sanders was up there offering last-minute amendments. He said, from his perspective, the bill just didn't go far enough.
The fossil fuel industry will receive billions of dollars in new tax breaks and subsidies over the next 10 years.
I will say, even with those compromises, the big climate activists, Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts, Brian Schatz from Hawaii, they still celebrated this.
There are huge advances in this bill. I would want to do more, but it's the only way that we can get the 50 votes in order to pass this bill.
They told me that, they can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. They congratulated their party for getting this done and pointed to what the bill does do.
In 8 years, we're going to see an incredible transformation of the way we manufacture, of the way we get around, the way we generate and distribute electricity.
Investments to car manufacturers that are working on electric vehicles, to renewable energy manufacturers that are working on batteries and storage, and tries to sort of even the playing field between renewable energy and clean energy and some of the oil and gas companies.
This adds to President Biden's victories he's logged in the past month, even as he was dealing with COVID. But his approval ratings remain low. Does this spending bill help Democrats at all heading into the midterms?
I mean, they surely think so. They have been excited, near giddy up here on Capitol Hill, even with no sleep. They have been all smiles.
They're going to see Democrats are actually getting things done that matter to them, mainstream things that average folks. This is not an esoteric list. This is things that people have always cared about.
They say that this gives them something to point to talk to voters about, just in time. I mean, we're talking about 3 months of the midterms. Like, they needed a win like this.
Give us some more Democrats. We can actually make Roe the law of the land. We can actually improve voting rights. We can actually improve gun safety.
And so we'll see. I think that some voters might be skeptical that the effects of this bill might still take a long time to play out, to be felt. The reality is some of the big cost-saving measures around drug pricing could take a few years to go into effect. But other Democrats say that there's just sort of a shock effect that happens in the market, that happens with big companies when major legislation like this is passed, is signed into law. So we'll see, but they are definitely planning to campaign on this.
And it's one hurdle. It now goes to the House. So what's next?
Yeah, it has to pass to the House before it heads to the president's desk. I mean, the House should move quickly on this. They do not want to stand in the way. They knew the tricky part of the negotiations was in the Senate. They want to get this wrapped up by the end of the week if they can. And like you said, the president, he was ecstatic too. He put out a statement immediately, called Senator Schumer. He wants to sign this as soon as possible.
Mary Alice Parks, I know you've been following it all. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Next up on Start Here, the latest on the flare-up of violence in Gaza. We're back in a bit.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any place else. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir, America's #1 most watched newscast, now streaming on ABC News Live.
Admit it, these days, what you need to know
seems to change just about every day.
What is it that you really want to know, need to know?
To help you not just get through your day,
but to make the most of it. Feel smarter.
Feel better.
Feel happier.
Well, how about a third hour of Good Morning America?
GMA 3, what you need to know. Now streaming on ABC News Live.
It's all about you. Elizabeth Holmes found guilty on 4 counts of fraud, facing the possibility of decades in prison. Now, we take you inside the courtroom and behind the scenes. The Dropout, Elizabeth Holmes on Trial. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
National parks are incredibly safe places. A crime will happen.
My wife had fallen. She's in really critical condition.
At that time, I thought it was just a tragic accident.
There's still a lot of questions we need to ask.
There were small things that didn't totally add up.
This is 2 lives for Harold that have died now. I was shocked. Something's not right.
Right now, with so much at stake, Sunday mornings, this is the place. Taking on all the tough questions, straightforward reporting, no spin, no hype, no bull. Thank you for making ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos the #1 Sunday morning news show versus the competition.
Welcome to This Week.
A weekend of deadly conflict erupting between Israeli forces and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group. Israeli airstrikes on buildings in Gaza targeted senior commanders. The Palestinian Health Ministry, though, says dozens of civilians, including children, were also killed. Palestinian militants also launched a barrage of missiles into Israel before a ceasefire agreement took hold. It's a test for Israel's interim government ahead of another election for Prime Minister. ABC's Jordana Miller joins us from Jerusalem. Jordana, what led to this latest round of fighting?
Right, that's a terrific question, Michelle, because I'm sure many Americans have never even heard of the terrorist group Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They're a fringe group, but a rival group of the main terrorist group that runs the Gaza Strip, Hamas. And you have to go back a few months to see what led us to this point. You know, back in March, there were a string of deadly attacks on Israeli civilians in places like Tel Aviv and some of the suburbs and cities in the south. And some of those attacks were carried out by this terrorist group. And essentially, Israel for the last few months has been carrying out oftentimes deadly raids against this group. And they decided to arrest one of the top commanders. There was a standoff for a few days. And in the end, Israel decided they would take a preemptive strike, and they assassinated one of their leaders. And that's essentially led to these 3 violent days. Palestinian Islamic Jihad lobbed an estimated 900 rockets towards Israel. Israel, responded with very heavy and devastating and deadly airstrikes throughout the Strip. The death toll stands at 41, and about 19 of those, almost half, are civilians. But given the kind of violence we see here, and especially with the Gaza Strip, this conflict stands out because it really was so short-lived. If this ceasefire, which, came into place at about 11:30 p.m. last night, local time, as long as that stands, this was, a relatively short round.
And is this group connected, though, to Hamas?
So Palestinian Islamic Jihad is funded almost entirely by Iran. They sometimes work in conjunction with Hamas. And whereas some Hamas leaders over the years have talked about possibly being able to negotiate with Israel, that has never come out of any leader from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In this case, I think they were trying to compete and win the Palestinian street. We have to remember that the Palestinian leadership is so weak and unpopular. There haven't been elections in over a decade, and people are so frustrated that there has been no progress towards an independent Palestinian state that we now have a situation where these militant groups are vying to be the group that represents the Palestinian people.
Egypt's been helping mediate with this. What sort of ceasefire agreement did they come to?
Egypt often plays a leading role in mediating conflicts between Israel and militants in the Gaza Strip. In this case, they were able to get some concessions from Israel regarding Islamic Jihad leaders who have been detained or arrested. There's one particular leader who's been on a hunger strike. It looks like maybe Egypt will work to get him released. And that was the main part of these negotiations. But the other really huge critical factor was Hamas, the group that runs the Gaza Strip. They didn't want to get involved in this fight. They didn't want an escalation because once Hamas is in the picture, you're not talking about a few days, you're talking about a war. And Hamas has barely recovered from the war last year. And they're on relatively good economic terms with Israel. What I mean by that is that the last government was able to increase the number of Gazan workers who can come into Israel every day. So it's up to 15,000. I mean, Gazans who work in Israel make 6 times what they can earn in the Gaza Strip, and the unemployment rate there is 50%. So Hamas was not in a position or interested in a huge escalation and a war. So they essentially put a ton of pressure on Palestinian Islamic Jihad to end this round of fighting and to sign that ceasefire with Egyptian help.
And Jordana, all this, of course, playing out with the new interim prime minister. Another round of elections is just months away for Israel. How is this impacting actions on both sides?
Well, I think that the political part of this from the Israeli story is one of the most interesting things to come out of this short conflict, because you have an interim prime minister, Yair Lapid, commanding this military operation. He is not a person with a military background. He didn't come out of special forces. And he needs to come out of this looking like he handled things calmly, with good judgment. He also worked in close conjunction with his defense minister, Benny Gantz. Both of them are going to work together to try to prevent Benjamin Netanyahu from winning again in November. And this episode, it's a win for them, and it's a political loss for Benjamin Netanyahu, who always argues nobody else can, be a security hawk and lead Israel through conflicts except him. Well, that hasn't proven to be the case if the ceasefire holds.
Jordana Miller, thank you very much joining us from Jerusalem.
Thanks, guys.
The war in Ukraine now nearing the 6-month mark. Russian forces remain in control of Europe's largest nuclear plant in southeastern Ukraine.
What's at stake is the nuclear safety and security of the biggest nuclear power plant in the European continent.
That plant is at the center of intense fighting and shelling, and no international agencies are being allowed in to monitor.
Because whoever controls those facilities controls the debate, coming to some type of decision.
ABC's Britt Clinnett joins us from the capital of Ukraine. Britt, nuclear safety has been a major concern since Russia invaded, with Russian troops focusing on taking control of several nuclear plants in the first few weeks of the attack. Now the head of Ukraine's nuclear agency warning of a possible catastrophe with the latest fighting at the Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia plant. What's changed in the last few days that's added urgency?
Well, firstly, Michelle, we should know that Russia took control of that plant, which is, by the way, Europe's largest nuclear plant. They took control of it in March. It's made up of 6 pressurized water reactors, and it also keeps radioactive waste. Ukrainian staff are still running the site, but Kyiv accuses Russia of terror tactics and kind of using it as a military base.
Russia is now using the plant as a military base to fire at Ukrainians, knowing that they can't and won't shoot back.
Russia using this site as a kind of cover for artillery attacks, with the thinking that, they wouldn't be silly enough to retaliate on a nuclear plant. So on Friday, at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, it was hit by shelling, reportedly causing one of the reactors to even shut down. Russia says it was Ukraine's doing and vice versa. But the plant was hit again overnight, according to the Ukrainian side. The attacks came dangerously close to where the station stores its dry spent nuclear fuel. And the UN nuclear watchdog says that these kind of strikes underline very real risk of nuclear disaster. So, of course, it is particularly worrying.
We hear quite regularly information, and we receive information about projectiles falling on the place, or drones, or things like that, which are, of course, compromising the physical integrity of the place.
As of now, there is no increase in radiation levels at the plant, and that's according to the Ukraine side again, though they also warn that it now actually might be harder to monitor any potential leakage because of damage to sensors, the monitoring sensors.
Zaporizhia is completely out of control. There are some contacts, they are faulty, they are patchy, they are not what you would expect and need to have.
So that's another worrying development, because if you can't read how high the levels are, then it's going to be hard to warn people if they need to evacuate, if they need to get away.
And so Russia is not giving any access to outside agencies at this plant?
Absolutely not. I mean, essentially, this is still a war zone, right? We are seeing attacks play out at this site. So certainly at this moment in time, there's no clear indication that Russia would allow some kind of independent international body to enter.
Now, Russia and Ukraine, of course, accusing each other, as you mentioned, of hitting that site. But what's really true, and what do we know of who's behind the potential disaster here?
It's so difficult to say, as you say, in this fog of war. You know, Russia took control of the plant in March, and as you say, both sides blaming each other for damaging parts of it. Ukraine's nuclear power plant agency, Energoatom, they say that Russian shelling has damaged 3 radiation monitors around the storage site, while on the Russian side, news agencies say it was Ukrainian forces that fired those shells. And it's not the first time that we've seen this kind of finger pointing during this war.
Ukraine accusing Russia of massacring the prisoners, staging a horrific false flag attack.
Just a couple of weeks ago, there was an attack on a prison camp in the occupied East. And both Russia and Ukraine said dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed. But that's pretty much all they can agree on. Russia says the prison was hit by Ukrainian rockets supplied by the US. Ukraine saying Russia was trying to destroy evidence that they'd tortured these prisoners. So, as you say, fog of war.
So beyond the shelling, though, at this plant, though, Britt, what else is Russia doing inside the plant that could also lead to potential disaster?
Well, a Russian opposition outlet published a report saying that Russian forces are storing explosives and mines in and around the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is an extremely worrying thought that they may have mined parts of the plant. Russian forces also may be firing rockets at Ukrainian positions from within or near the plant, again, kind of using it as a cover for attacks. We did speak to the head of Energoatom, Petro Kotin, here in Kyiv, and he did believe that Russia had mined the turbine hall, at least, of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. So again, very concerning developments.
If this situation will continue, then there will be full blackout on the plant.
He said that if Russia were to disconnect nuclear power from the whole of Ukraine, from the Ukrainian grid completely, effectively cutting off a large supply of energy to the country, this would, of course, also have disastrous consequences. It could lead to a blackout. So the stakes are really high here. This is Europe's largest power plant. And if something goes wrong, the public health consequences, as I say, could go far beyond the battlefield and far beyond Ukrainian borders alone.
And Ukraine's President Zelensky is also sounding the alarm to that point. What does he want Europe to do?
Well, yeah, in his daily address, Zelensky said he spoke with the European Council President, Charles Michel, and made it clear that Russia was responsible, and reiterating his label of them as a terrorist state. He said, God forbid, if something irreparable happens, no one will stop the wind that will spread the radioactive contamination. So clearly a big warning there, not just to Europe, but the rest of the world. He said, therefore, a principled response of the international community to these Russian attacks on the Zaporizhia NPP, the largest in Europe, is needed right now. It's not exactly clear what he means by principled response here, but Kotin, as I said, the head of the nuclear agency here in Ukraine, who we spoke to, he said it should be declared a protected zone, no entry zone for militaries. And this is what actually is needed, he said, to resolve all problems, which are now just actually threatening the entire world.
It's vitally important that the IAEA get access to understand what's happening in these facilities.
So there have been calls also for the UN to just take control of the plant and to remove it, to take it out of Russian hands, to avoid what could potentially be a big catastrophe.
The stakes keep getting higher and the situation more dire as this war rages on. Britt Clinnett, thank you.
Absolutely. They really do. Thanks, Michelle.
And one last thing. The hunt is on in the Florida Everglades. Not for alligators. Hundreds of pro wranglers and amateurs from around the country are competing in the Florida Python Challenge.
Look how fat she is.
Searching in the marshes for massive Burmese pythons. The snake is deemed an invasive species in the state and threat to the Everglades ecosystem.
Even if we get a nice 12-foot fighter, that's fine.
Those pythons that grow some 20 feet or more have been putting the squeeze on native animals, including dogs, cats, even alligators, for years.
We've found 7-foot alligators inside of them.
Inside them.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to look for now.
Yes.
The Southeast Asia reptile, brought to the U.S. as exotic pets, made a new home in the Sunshine State after being dumped by owners. And this slithering stalker has no known predators except humans.
If you enjoy nature, you enjoy being out here, you don't mind the bugs, you don't mind coming out when the pythons are moving, which is muggy, buggy, middle of the night, do it.
That's where the hunters come in, tracking and catching the pythons and posing for postable photos. The goal? Eradicate as many pythons as possible and rake in a cash prize, maybe some bragging rights.
Wow, man.
Last year, the state says more than 220 pythons were captured. The 10-day competition ends August 14th, and if you miss out, there's always next year. And that's where we leave it. For more on these stories, check out abcnews.com or the ABC News app. I'm Michelle Franzen. Brad's back tomorrow. Have a great week.